Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Fulmer Reservoir in Southampton, Massachusetts. So, how did Holyoke acquire the land for the Fulmer Reservoir?
They did it in the most gentle possible way. They didn't want to upset the life of anyone out in Southampton, so they would go around and ask farmers, you want to sell the land this year, your house this year? And, usually, of course, they say no. But when they were ready to sell, they would remember that. And they had been doing that out in the Fulmer area for a very long time, decades and decades. They had been doing it even, I think, from the 1870s onwards, when they built their first reservoir in Holyoke, Ashley, in 1873. They started a process of also buying land in Southampton, so someday they could grow. And the reason why was because Holyoke was a very ambitious industrial city that needed lots of water, not only for people, but for as many businesses, including the paper mills, which you would use a lot. So today, we're going to talk about the history of the Fulmer Reservoir, and that's spelled F-O-M-E-R. And then we're going to talk about some events around that reservoir area, and they're going to talk about a book that was written about the Fulmer area in Southampton, because Southampton lost 1/5 of its area under deed to the Holyoke Waterworks Company, and a lot of farmers would leave their land. Of course, like I mentioned, they left it very gently. So, a lot to talk about, and this whole method is written up in a book that was written by a man named Wright, and I think I have a link from my page out to this one. So it's not written in a format that you could just read very quickly. It's written in a format that each one of the farmers has a little story about them and the farm out there.
And tell us about the early history of the Fulmer Reservoir.
Okay, so when was it made? The dam was built from 1896 to 1897, and it was 900 feet long, and it was 20 feet high. All right, now, there was out there, a home was built, and they built that because every reservoir associated with the Holyoke Waterworks Company had to have a caretaker's home, and there was none out in that region, so they built one for them. And that was built in 1896, right when they started to build up this dam. And the pipeline was built in 1898. Why? Because you had to get the water from the Fulmer Reservoir into the Ashley Reservoir. And that connection was incredibly long. They didn't have the ability to go over the East Mountain, which was large, so what they did, they went around from Southampton in the direction of Westfield, and then in the direction of Bushnotch, or cut between the East Mountain. And from there, they can then go towards the back or southern side of the Ashley Reservoir itself. And that pipeline, I think, is like 15 miles long. But you didn't need to pipe the water, because the water in the Fulmer was about 500 feet higher than that in the Ashley, so it could push itself along. Now, there's some very interesting stories about this area, including storms and diseases, so forth, and we're going to talk about that next.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, and his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what are some events that happened in and around the Fulmer Reservoir toward the end of its existence?
Good question, because a lot of adventurous things happened out there. Well, in 1942, that caretaker's house I was just talking about was hit by a lightning bolt, and they had to build a new one out there. And they have a picture of it in the Holy Transcript Telegram. All right, also, in 1955, there was a hurricane, Diane, I believe, and when it hit, it severed or breached the Carmody Dam itself out there, the Manhan Dam, and this Fulmer Reservoir was leaking for a while, and they had to put a temporary fix onto it. But 2 years later, anyways, 1957, they started building the Carmody Reservoir, which would take on the name Ty Carmody, which is a vast reservoir. So some strange things were happening. Now, another case that happens that's pretty important was in the beginning of the site, in 1910, there was a typhoid case in a lumberyard at the Fulmer Reservoir. And this shut down the whole reservoir system for 4 months because they didn't trust that the typhoid fever didn't get into the water. And it might have hurt someone in Holyoke when they drink it, right? So a lot of adventurous things happened out there. And you don't always expect these things, but if you look through the 100-year history of any of these reservoirs, they always have amazing stories.
And tell us about the Wright book.
All right. Now, that book, the Wright book, is wonderful. I loved going through it, but of course, I love the reservoirs very much out in Southampton. It's a book written between 1892 to 1905. This person named Wright, he would write a story about each one of the families that lived on those farms that Holyoke Waterworks was buying up. And this is out in the western part of Southampton called the Fulmer area. And that whole area is called that. And it really means that the tributary of the Manhan that goes up there was called the Fulmer, and had a lot of foam developing in the cascading water. And so they called it the Foamer, Fulmer River. All right, and people started saying this so much, and they shortened it, left the A out, and became the Fulmer River. So, this whole area has a book written about it, and it has a really cool map. That on that map, it shows a lot of the farmers by putting a little dot down, and then they put their initials of the first name and then the full last name, and they put what route, highway, or road they were on, and what brook they were near, and they'd write stories about each of the farmers and how they had to live there with their family, right? And this book is called the Homesteads. All right, and all you have to do is get a free membership to FamilySearch.org first, and then go to my website on the Fulmer Reservoir, and I'm going to have a link there. I have a link there, and it says Homesteads in capital letter. You can click on it and start reading this interesting book. A copy of it is also at the Southampton Library.
And Thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of other podcasts on his website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, what life was like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the new intake reservoir in Southampton, Massachusetts. What are intake reservoirs?
Intake reservoirs are reservoirs designed simply to make the sediment that's agitated up into the stream settle down so that it can be pure water can be distributed through the pipelines into the community. And you can have an intake reservoir before a reservoir or one after a reservoir. Depends upon the geography and the way the pipelines are situated. So they're very important. Now, an intake reservoir exists in Holyoke. One also exists in Southampton, and both of them have always been owned by the Holyoke Waterworks. So they have two, and they're always used for reservoirs that are used for drinking water, never in power reservoirs, for instance. Now, in other communities, they also have them. I don't know about other communities well enough to tell you where they are, but they're very, very important. They don't have to be very big. All they got to do is hold the water for a little while, and then once sediment is really settled down, then they can release it. Now, engineers probably have studied these enough to know how big they have to be, where it's best to put them, so forth. So today we're going to tell you about the new intake reservoir in Southampton and why it's called that. And then, is it worthwhile to go out there? There's a mixed bag of questions here. So hopefully you understand what these are for. But it tells you in the name, intake. It's taken in water. Now, all reservoirs take in water, but they intake just to settle the sediments.
And tell us of the history of the new intake reservoir in Southampton.
Yes, this one was built in 1917. It's on the Manhan River. Specifically, it's on one of its northern tributary branches. And it's still functional. It's still there. The in and out pipeline that carries the water in and out is 20 inches wide. That, by pipeline standard, that's actually pretty big. Now, it used to be an intake after the White Reservoir, but the White Reservoir in Southampton and West Hampton is not functional anymore. So it's still an intake, but it's an intake before the Ty-Carmody now. It used to be an intake before the Manhan Reservoir out there. So it's done a lot of jobs. It was after the White and before the Manhan. Then later, in the 50s, it became the one between the White and the Ty-Carmody. And then in the 80s, when the White went out of commission, it became an intake on that stream for just the Ty-Carmody. So it's done a lot of jobs through its history. Now, this reservoir is 63 feet higher than the former Manhan Dam Reservoir, which is called the Fulmer Reservoir. And it's still very high. And it's done a great job. I visited it before, so I could see it. I would say its length of its dam was maybe, let's call it about 180 feet wide, And I would guess a dam is about, from its water base, about 15 feet high. Now, it's not very big. The amount of reservoir it holds back is probably as much as a football field, but it's there for one functional reason only.
And before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, why is it called the New Intake Reservoir?
Since Holyoke Waterworks has 2 intake reservoirs, you're going to call one intake, and then when you build a new one, you can call it a new intake reservoir. The one based in Holyoke was actually at first based in Northampton. It's still there, but that part of Northampton became a part of Holyoke when Holyoke annexed that land. And it was there in 1882. And it was an intake off of the Roaring Brook so that Holyoke can have 2 sources of water, the Ashley Reservoir System and the intake reservoir system. They thought that was enough, just calm the water down off of that branch. Now, this intake had nothing to do with the Ashley. They're about 5 miles apart. So it always had to do with the area around the Whiting Street area. When the Whiting Street Reservoir was built in Holyoke in 1888 and functional by 1890, it already had an intake reservoir downstream of it, this older intake. And so it was ready, and Whiting Street Reservoir is just a storage reservoir. And it took the water from the Roaring Brook and stored it, but it had a wonderful intake reservoir already. Now, just to give you an idea, the annual maintenance on that older intake reservoir, they'd have to stop up the waters every year with a cofferdam, and then they have to sweep out the sediment from the bottom because it would settle during the year. There'd be enough sediment on the bottom that it'd fill up the 3 feet high and about a football field in size. They had to sweep it all out. That's how much sediment they got out of there. Now, the new intake reservoir, when it came around in 1917 out in Southampton, but still part of the Holyoke Waterworks, it took on that name because there was already an intake reservoir associated with the Holyoke Waterworks Company. And it was called a new intake, and it did the same job. And it too had to be cleaned out once in a while.
And is it worthwhile visiting the reservoir?
All right, if you ever go out to Southampton looking at these reservoirs, you cannot go to the front of the Tyke Harmony. It's closed to the public. You can go on a dirt road for about 3 miles and get to see the back of the Tyke Harmony, but don't trespass from the back. Now, when you start to see the back, then you're going to start to see a dirt road on the side of the dirt road you took in. That's for the Holyoke Waterworks workers to go into the new intake reservoir. And then also you can go up the dirt road another 1.5 miles and visit the White Reservoir, which is now a breached reservoir. But if you do all 3 on the same day and you have a good car or a truck, then it's well worth the time. There's also a cemetery in the Tyke Harmony area on that dirt road. Now, I did this about 6 years ago. I went on the dirt road, and so I got to see the back of the Tyke Harmony. When I went into the new intake reservoir, I got to take some pictures, and after about 3 minutes out there, I started getting attacked by horseflies, so much so that I had to run out. There were so many of them, and they were chasing me right to my car. And so, is it worth visiting? Yeah, if you love reservoirs, but make sure you have a lot of bug spray on you.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. You can check out a large selection of other tours at this website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and tours posted daily. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for tuning in to our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Comeau. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. This tour spotlights the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the White Reservoir, located throughout Southampton and West Hampton, Mass. So tell us about the early history of the White Reservoir.
This reservoir, the White Reservoir, was started in the year 1910. The land was purchased, and all of it finished being purchased in 1910. The land had been bought before that, and Holyoke did such a great job in asking people if they want to sell their land. They have been doing it for decades and decades out in Southampton. Even with the Ty Carmody, even with the Manham Reservoir, even with the White Reservoir, they did it. They asked gently, and they offered a higher price than the land and the house were really worth. And that way, they avoided that Quabbin situation where people had to be forced to sell. All right, and it was worked on from 1910 to 1912 and finished on July 16th, 1913. So that was the big year to get it going. And you got to remember what kind of dam this is. It's upstream on a tributary of the Manham of the older Manham Reservoir and Dam. So it's called a retainer dam and reservoir. That means it just holds water so that the Manham, which is downstream by a couple miles, could hold even more and let sediments settle even more. In between is a reservoir called the intake reservoir, and that settles down even more. So this is a retainer dam just to store a lot of water when it was needed. All right, now, the people, again, were not kicked off, but one very important house was retained, and that was the Lyman Homestead, bought in 1911 for the caretaker of the White Reservoir. And that caretaker was a woman for about 40 years. Now, today we're going to find out what the White Reservoir is nowadays and why it started to fall apart. Or at least I'll give you some ideas why, and then what should this location end up turning into in the future. Hopefully, there will be a good use for it and not a bad use. So, there's more history to it, and I'll tell you about that. The gate around it was made in the year 1947, and it's not that old. But since it's been abandoned, this reservoir, and the dam is breached as of 1982, hardly anyone goes up there anymore. So everything looks kind of new except for the dam itself. Now, it's located on what's called Sand Hill and has a very steep grade from there. That's partly why the reason there's intake reservoir after this one, to be sure that the sediments start to settle out. Now, in 1939, I'm going to tell you what started to happen, so that's a very important date, and we'll keep that in mind.
And what does one find at the White Reservoir nowadays?
The White Reservoir has become an oasis of not much. And so, inside of the former reservoir area, trees, brush, flowers are growing. And the gates have been abandoned, but they're still in good shape. There's still a spillway and a long causeway. There's still the dam, but it was breached towards its bottom portion. And if you do go out there, it's a long way out there. And if you do go out there, it's a nice sight because nature is coming back. And so it's been abandoned since 1982. That's 42 years of the water not being in there most of the time. But once in a while, in April, May, and October, when you get lots of rainstorms, it starts to fill up in height up to the level that the breach allows it to fill up. And so if you go out there, you'll see a storage of water. And then in between, you got to look at nature trying to come back in this situation. So it's a kind of a peculiar thing. But it's still safe. You're not supposed to trespass there. But of course, I go out there anyways. And I encourage you to on your own.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, why did the dam for the White Reservoir start to fall apart?
All right. As of about 1939, the face of the dam started coming off. And in that year, the Works Progress Administration took up a maintenance trying to fix that face upwards. But in the years to come, it kept causing trouble. In 1947, again, it was in very poor shape, including the face of it, the walls on its side, and the spillway. And it was drained in that year, 1947, and a contractor fixed it up again. All right? And so they kept on with it and on with it. And in 1982, they decided it's not worth keep fixing up every year, even if it's a little bit, because we have the big Ty-Carmody Reservoir out in Southampton, which is gigantic, and so that serves all our needs. So it served a great need for 1913 up to 1982, almost 70 years. And sure, it was replaced downstream by a couple miles by Ty-Carmody, and so we didn't need it anymore. But there are some that question whether, in the beginning, from 1910 and 1912, it was really put together very well. Maybe not. So, it fell apart, but they didn't even need it anymore ways after a while.
And what should this location turn into?
I think they should take down most of the dam and most of the big side spillway and change this area into a nature preserve. And if that's done and it's put into it forever has to stay natural, then Holyoke would be happy because their watershed, and this is part of the watershed of the Ty-Carmody Reservoir in Southampton, will stay natural. Southampton will be happy because they don't have a big white ghost dam out there anymore, even if it's on a dirt road. And then nature people will be happy. You could put a trail around there. I think there's already a part of a trail on one side. And you would have nature return. And Holyoke could make them very happy, the residents of Southampton. And Southampton has been great to Holyoke through the centuries because they've had so many dams out there, Holyoke, and so much water has been delivered. If they do this a little bit, then both parties should be quite happy. And the Holyoke Water Works have enough money. They don't really sell this land off to anyone, and they don't want development there anyways, and no one's going to buy it. So they could sell it off to Southampton, sell it off to Kestrel Land Trust, or sell it to other nature groups, and you'll have another nature preserve out there, and the water coming in will still be pristine. So I think this is a great idea. I don't know if it'll ever happen though.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He offers public and private tours as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Ty Carmody Reservoir, located in Southampton, Massachusetts. So, what is the history of this reservoir?
This is a fine reservoir. In fact, it's the reservoir now that serves most of the water needs of Holyoke. And that's a lot of water because not only people, but also all the businesses and all the schools, so forth. Now, today we're going to talk about the Carmody pipeline and who the reservoir serves, and then how did Holyoke get a hold of all this land in another community of Southampton? It must have happened somehow. And is it equivalent to a Quabbin situation? Right. So we want to talk about this reservoir now. Formerly, there was a Fulmer Dam and reservoir out there, which we'll talk about another time. So it had a predecessor reservoir that's now underneath the present Ty Carmody reservoir. It's gone. And this reservoir, you cannot get into it anymore, or you never could, because they built it such that no people can go near it except the workers for Holyoke Water Works. If you want to get a glimpse of it, you have to go around the very back on a dirt road for 5 miles of travel on dirt road. And so most people don't want to do that. It's on a tributary of the Manhattan River, and it's blocked by a very, very large dam that's called the Manhattan Dam. The dam was completed in 1956. Now, Ty Carmody is named after two people. Ty is the engineering firm that helped make this reservoir. They also helped make a lot of structures, whether they be reservoirs, sewer pipes, buildings, dams, inside of Holyoke. And they were based in Holyoke for a long time, and then they moved out to Westfield. And Carmody is named after Thomas Carmody, who it was, in Holyoke, it was on the board of advisors for Holyoke Water Works for many decades, close to a half century, in fact. And he died in 1937, and they named it after him when it was built. He gave so much to really bring that reservoir system of Holyoke up to an incredible level. Now, you have to get the water from Southampton to here. The way it was done in the past is vastly different from the way they do it presently. When there was a Manhattan dam out there making a Fulmer reservoir, they had a pipeline that went into Westfield first, then through Bush's Nosh, and then the back way of Ashley Reservoir. And they don't do that, obviously, anymore.
And what does the Carmody pipeline do?
Alrighty, the Carmody pipeline makes the shortest trip possible over range, gets it up to elevation, and they want to bring it to the fluoridation plant of Holyoke, which is next to McLean Reservoir. So what they did in 1988, they made a Carmody pipeline, and it was built from the Ty Carmody Dam, the Manhattan Dam, to the northern tip of the McLean Reservoir. All right, and you have to pump it over that mountain called East Mountain. All right, now how are you going to ever do that so that you're not going to make a great cost? All right, before when they brought the water in, they brought it in a long way. Now they're trying to bring it the short way over a mountain. And so what they do is they have the pipeline pass by part of the Manhattan River, and they use the power of the Manhattan River to push into a massive pump. and that pump is attached to the pipeline itself and has a pump in there. So one pump is pushing the other pump, and that second pump is pushing the water inside the Carmody pipeline over the East Mountain. And then up it comes the top of West River Road, Route 202. And then it's made it to the top. The pipeline goes under the highway and goes into the tip of the McLean Reservoir. Okay, so you have it at high pressure. You have it pumped up at a short distance, maybe about 5 miles instead of 18 miles going around the flatter way. All right, you don't have to use too much money because you're using the massive power of the Manhattan River to pump it upwards. But you got to be clever enough to keep that pump going. But a Manhattan is a steady flow, so they don't have to worry about that at all.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for any of his various tours or find out more information, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours or other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214B@yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, who does the reservoir serve?
It serves the people of Holyoke and the businesses of Holyoke. Now, by agreement with East Hampton and Southampton, since the Manhattan flows through those places, and they take some of the water for power, and especially Southampton, since they have under deed land, Holyoke has under deed land from Southampton, they agreed with Southampton and partly East Hampton that if you ever want some of this water or piping in this pipeline, you can have it for very, very low cost. But neither Southampton or East Hampton ever took them up on that offer. And so, thus, all this water is for Holyoke itself. Now, when it was built in 1956, and they started planning in the late 40s, they thought that the population of Holyoke, which at one time was about 66,000 people, would keep climbing to about 100,000 people by 1960. It never did that, and in fact decreased. And so the Tide Carmody, it has more water than Holyoke really needs, but that's fine, because, for instance, if there's ever a bacterial scare, then vast amounts of water is solution by dilution. That means that vast amount of water with a little bit too much bacterium in place can be diluted quickly. That's also what Quabbin does. So it's great to have extra water around, and Holyoke definitely has extra here and other reservoirs.
And how did Holyoke acquire all this land?
By the most graceful pattern. And they had been doing it from the 1890s onwards into the 1950s. And they did not do it the Quabbin way. The people in Boston, the government of Massachusetts, decided in Quabbin to take it over almost by force. But Holyoke, over a 60-year span, gracefully kept asking the people in the area of this section of Southampton, and they own by deed 20% of Southampton. They would ask them every year, if you want to sell your land this year, we'll pay this amount of money for the home and land. And if you keep at it for 60 years, eventually the owner will say, fine. Society was changing too. It was farmlands with farmhouses on it. And when that started going away and people got more professional jobs, then it was easier to take over this kind of land because it's so far away from their jobs. And so working at it for 16 years, they finally succeeded. And they succeeded by much earlier on than that to make what was called the Fulmer Reservoir, but that was small. To get up to the Tide Carmody size, which is many billions of gallons of water, you had to buy much more land, and they did it so gracefully. And a book was written about this situation in detail, telling about all the families that lived there and what their homes looked like and other parameters or feature of the area. The whole area is called the Fulmer part of Southampton. And that's a nice book to read because you can read about all these different farmhouses.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. You can check out a large selection of our podcasts at his website,